Hi, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Beacon, where we discuss the news behind the news. I'm your Chief Revenue Officer, Daralyse Lyons. Emily Smith, publisher and owner, is here as per usual. And today, we invited a special guest, Ben Bennett, who is the Beacon's first full-time staff reporter. We talked about Ben a little bit in our last episode and thought it might be good to have him on to talk about Report for America experience and reporting for the Beacon and all that jazz. So hi, Emily, and hi, Ben, and thanks so much for doing this with me today.
Yay.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, awesome. Well, I think why don't we kick it off by starting with Ben, tell us a little bit about your journalism experience and what brought you to Report for America. Why did you apply to be a Report for America core member?
Yeah, I think starting from the beginning, I got into journalism in high school. I started writing movie reviews for our school paper, and that's very different than what I do now. But So I went to school, to American University in DC for journalism, and I wrote movie reviews there as well. But then I started getting into some more, hard journalism, DC politics, about culminating in the stadium moving out of DC, possibly. It didn't happen, but sort of the, not just political effects, but the cultural effects and that sort of intersection. And then my grandfather actually ran a local paper for much of his professional life. And then so after college, I came back to Philadelphia and I interned and worked as a fellow at WHYY, sort of doing that hyper local news in Philly. And I really enjoyed that. And then when I saw that Report for America, who I'd heard about in college, but it just wasn't the right time, So then when I heard they do their applications open yearly, and I thought it was a great opportunity and just a mentorship, and then being able to stay in local news. I just thought it was such a cool opportunity to try it out. And they had you list what outlets you're interested in. And I think I picked 3 or 4. And of course, the Beacon was one of them. And I ended up interviewing, and I thought the fit was fantastic, was really great. And yeah, so that's pretty brief explanation of how I ended up here today, I guess.
Yeah, we'll love that. And just to give people a little bit of an explainer, people who are watching and listening, and we'll put links to this in the show notes. We've written a few articles about sort of what Report for America does and how they act, almost like if anyone's heard of Teach for America or something like that. Report for America is a national organization. They vet journalistic applicants from all across the country who are interested in being matched with different Report for America partner newsrooms. It's a highly selective process, both on the reporter side and then on the news organization side. And so hundreds of news organizations apply throughout the country. Only a few or, a smaller cohort of that are selected, and they go through a rigorous vetting process. And then thousands of journalists apply, and it's a very competitive process. And Report for America matches 5 potential reporters with newsrooms across the country, and those reporters get interviewed and then sort of selected. And then Report for America pays 50% of a reporter's first year salary, and then decreasing per year for up to 3 years. And that newsroom is responsible for raising the rest. So that's just a little bit of an update, but let's pivot, Emily, to talking about on the Beacon's side of things. So here Ben is, he brought us up to, he's applied to be a Report for America reporter. He selected the Beacon as one of his choices, but can you talk through a little bit why the Beacon made a decision to onboard a full-time staff reporter and how that beat was selected, and give us the Beacon side of the equation?
Well, we hired you. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have needed more reporters. We've never had a full-time staff reporter, and it seemed like a good opportunity for us. Specifically, Cyril had been asking to report on more school districts, specifically in Lower Bucks, for some time. We just haven't had the bandwidth to cover all of the school boards and everything that goes on with that. And that is kind of our bread and butter reporting that we do, is municipal government like that. So Report for America seemed like it could be a good fit. And honestly, it was our first year applying, and we didn't think that we would get selected, but we did. Here we are. Yeah. And how did we pick Ben? There was multiple interviews, right? Multiple interviews, and Ben had a good set of skills, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think too, you mentioned that we didn't have the bandwidth to cover, all of the municipal activities and the lower Bucks school district at the depth and breadth that we would want to. For people who aren't super familiar with the news, they might be like, well, why not? Like, couldn't you just send someone to the school board meetings, or just why is it so hard? So like maybe, I mean, I know we're talking a lot about building out Ben's beat in education in Lower Bucks County. So like, can either or both of you talk a little bit about why like it requires bandwidth and capacity and an ongoing presence in a community to be able to really do journalism, like about a specific issue?
Can I start with saying that Bucks County is large, geographically large, beyond being a large county with a population of 600-ish thousand. Geographically, it's really spread out. So we have had a lot of reporters in the Doylestown area and then up into some Upper Bucks areas. But because of the geographic separation, that's actually one of the harder parts, is getting our reporters who want to cover, hyper local stuff, right? So they're reporting stuff very local to them, and Lower Bucks is just not that close. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. But also, like, what does it entail, right? School board meetings. I think it's also worth noting that Bucks County has 13 school districts. So we have been able to cover, I would say, 3 or 4 pretty well over the last number of years. Those school boards meet usually twice a month. There's usually like a workshop meeting and then an actual meeting where they vote on stuff. And with 13 school districts, that's a lot to keep track of, beyond any follow-ups to any of the stories that come out of that. Like, how did they come up with the things that they're voting on? Who are the random people that are trying to close libraries or change the curriculum entirely or anything like that? So I think that the sheer scope of it within Bucks County is worth noting, just in size and the amount of school districts and all of that stuff.
And Ben, you had experience sort of doing education reporting at HYY. And so like, do you want to talk a little bit about, I know you just started fairly recently, but like you're coming in and kind of building out this beat. And so for anyone who's like, doesn't really know what that means or what that entails, like what goes into crafting an education beat and what kinds of things are covered, and like kind of how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. I think a big part is obviously everyone will think like the superintendent, the school board, sort of the decision makers on top. But I found reporting in Philly and just in general, a big part of any beat is really, and what I try to focus on is who's affected by this, whether that's the parents, the students, the community members in general. So I think you touched on it a little, just making sure your presence is felt. I mean, already the other week I wrote a story on Bristol Township's food service director. And after writing that story, I sent it to him, and it apparently got passed around to a bunch of people in the district. And then a couple of days later, I was out reporting and they all said that they read the story. So it's just sort of things like that, where I do think covering school board are obviously, like Emily said, it's kind of the bread and butter of an education reporter. That's what you sort of, I think the base level of your duty as an education reporter is just informing the community, like, hey, this is what goes into these decisions. This is what's happening. But I think taking that step where you're not just watching the live stream or attending the meetings, you're sort of building these enterprise stories around who's affected by these policies. I think that's can really set not just the Beacon's education coverage apart, just in general, like the best education reporting that I've read or I was just reading something in Education Weekly about Morrisville almost shutting down last year, and they really went in depth and they talked to teachers and students, and sort of building that holistic view on a beat, I think is really important and something that I'm really looking forward to doing here.
Well, and as the person who sort of worked on the grant application behind the scenes, Cyril was the one who identified, lower a void in our education coverage in Lower Bucks County, but that also came out of a series of kind of community meetings and interviews that Cyril had with people, that I had with people in the community. And one of the things that was reflected to me when I was speaking with people as we were deciding sort of what beat to apply for was like a lot of kind of, I don't know if resentment is the right word, but maybe skepticism, some healthy skepticism about reporters who just helicopter in and like report on an issue and don't really have an understanding of the major players or why this might be interesting, and haven't built up relationships in a community. And so like, I think sometimes you mentioned, Ben, reading other successful reporting, and I find that the best reporting really has a more comprehensive understanding of the holistic, issues, and isn't just like sort of sensational, like, oh, this thing happened, and then kind of reporting back on that. And so, we are a local news organization. And so can you, Ben, talk maybe a little bit about sort of how you see local news versus more national news, or like, like how you're building this education beat in a way that emphasizes the local perspective?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I sort of got started in local news in Philly, I sort of had that idea, or everything was a little separate to me, like local versus national news, like completely like two separate entities. But really what I've come to realize, and I think I am applying in most of my work, is that obviously everyone knows that issues up top will always trickle down in effect. But I think some of the most powerful local news is like, how are these decisions made like 500 miles away affecting this family in Levittown, in like Bristol Township? How are these decisions made by the current administration affecting English learning students in Morrisville? Like, how are these decisions made by very powerful people affecting us at a local level? And I think if you can sort of translate that to readers, because a lot of times I think, obviously, Dare, you said the fear of like helicopter journalism, but I think you want to make sure that people know that everything's sort of interconnected. Like even decisions made at a local level, like at a borough council meeting, are influenced by the bigger decisions made outside of our state. So I think sort of tying issues together and finding that intersection can really help not only me as a reporter sort of understand everything that's going on. I think it can help readers understand and maybe even just think more about what they're reading, about what they're seeing. And I think it turns into like, because as reporters, and there's watchdog journalism, there's a lot of different service journalism, but I think really we're just objective reporters of the truth. And then if you sort of lay that out for readers and let them decide, I think it's a really effective way of keeping the community informed, which is what I think Cyril told me, that was one of the things he wanted, that I'm here, or the Beacon's here to keep the community informed. And yeah, by doing that, I feel like that's sort of the best way and from my point of view. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because for years, I have been saying local is national. Like we have like a national appeal.
Yeah.
And the reason we have it is because we cover local stories and show the through lines, and people can read it in another state and be having the same exact things happening in their local community that are happening in Bucks County in a local community, because of what you're talking about, the intersection of all of the national, organizations, federal government, all of that stuff, and how it filters through, and you could see the same thing repeated. That's actually, like, I think the most interesting thing that we do. So
Yeah. Well, and I think it's about being able to do both effectively, like have that local credibility, build that, community presence, and also be able to contextualize, to the point that you're both making, what is happening within a larger infrastructure or the anomalies. Like sometimes there are outliers, like, oh, here's what's happening nationally, and like here's this small pocket of community that doesn't seem to be paying attention to this, or that doesn't seem to be affected by whatever this global or national issue is. And so the beacon is kind of an interesting animal in that it started off as an experiment and has since evolved, and pretty quickly evolved, into being like a rigorous community journalism that's very fact-based. And so I don't know, Emily, if you could talk maybe a little bit about like how the beacon's work over time and journalism over time has kind of maybe shifted.
yeah. Well, I mean, the beacon has changed significantly since we began, and it was experimental. But I think, I come from a tech background, and I believe in iteration and, fail fast, and repeat. And I think that that's something with our journalism, is that we try things and then we see like the resonating effects of different things that we do. And it's through the last 5 years, we have been narrowing down not only what people want to read, but what's important to the community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, to that point, Ben, like how, as you're out there in the community gathering story ideas, like how do you know what's worth following up on? Like, like tell us kind of like a recent story example, maybe like how did you find out about an issue? What was your process? Like,
Yeah. Well, most recently about the food service story I was talking about, that's at the front of my mind. Actually, Cyril told me about, he is like, hey, maybe you could just write a little thing about this free food service in Bristol Township. So I got into contact with the district, and they sent me the info for the food service director, and I called Brandon. And then about halfway through that interview, I could sort of feel his passion and how much he really cared about this. So sort of like that, I guess, like journalistic intuition, where I could tell like this is something he really cares about. And if he cares about it and it's something as impactful as this, I'm sure the entirety of the community feels the same way. And so I turned that into more of a longer feature piece. I went out to one of the free food services. I talked to a family, and then that clearly resonated with the community. So sort of things like that, where I can feel that people are very passionate. And then the same thing on the other end of the spectrum, where if it's something I know that people are similarly very passionate about, but will get is like a highly contentious issue, like the data centers, or my first assignment at WHYY was a Charlie Kirk vigil, like stuff like that, where I know people emotions are high. I know that is worth covering, but also I do think you have to be careful. And if I can speak a little from like a photojournalist point of view, I think like a common thing when you're starting out is everyone like goes to cover a protest, and you're taking pictures. And I think it's very easy, and I know I did when I first started out, to sort of just take pictures of the signs. Like that's sort of the thing that jumps out at you, the thing that like you're there to see the signs. But I think like looking to find those smaller moments, and then I think those are the great shots that everyone you can sort of feel, and there's a lot of emotion behind it. And I think it's very similar when you're writing a piece, that sure, like this breaking news will make a lot of people angry, or it will invoke a lot of emotion, and you should obviously cover that. But I don't think you should just stop there. You should also follow through and try and find like the smaller scenes within that sort of big news, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I see, Emily, you're nodding along. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't know that I have anything specific to add to that. I was visually thinking about it, and because I'm a graphic designer, so
Yeah. No, I love that. And Ben, like you gave this sort of like this micro moment of this positive example of you wrote a story about this like food service worker who's super passionate about what he does. And then you shared that with him and, you shared that with his community and like, yeah, like building that community goodwill, telling those community stories is really positive and uplifting. But you also did mention like, when it is a contentious issue, or perhaps you've been covering someone who maybe like does not like how they were portrayed in an article or whatever else, like, can you share a little bit about like how you navigate that as a journalist, whether it's was at the Beacon or, somewhere previously?
Yeah. I think it's important to I think if you're doing good work, if you're doing fact-based reporting, you shouldn't be afraid to stand by your work no matter what. I've gotten angry emails, I've gotten called at like 9 p.m. and yelled at. But if you're standing, you should, as a journalist, and if there are any young journalists, I don't know. I don't know if it's my place to say as a 24-year-old, but if there's anyone just getting into it, like, don't be afraid to stand by your work, because more often than not, I think like 99% of the time, we are good researchers and we fact check our work. And if your work is the truth, then it doesn't matter what they say. They can't really do anything. So I know it's easier said than done, especially if, like I said, you're getting yelled at or chewed out on the phone. It might be a little intimidating, but like they want you to feel intimidated. And I think one of my favorite professors in university said that if you do get people mad, if you are getting yelled at, you're doing something right, because you're getting towards that truth that they don't want to either. Most of the time, it's not like they don't want it to get out, but they'd rather you just not talk about it. And I think that's sort of at the core of what journalism is just showing the whole truth, and not, you should never not put something in just because you think someone will get mad at you, because I think then you're not painting the whole picture.
Well, and
that's
Emily,
sorry.
yeah. Yeah, well, no, I was just going to say, like, as the owner and the publisher of the Beacon, the buck stops with you. And so I'm sure you've gotten both like the happy, we love the Beacon, thank you so much for all the work that you do, emails and letters, and then kind of all the threats of lawsuits and everything in between.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd love to hear you speak about that a little bit if you're.
Yeah, that's why we have so much insurance. It's so we can cover stuff, and say the truth out loud. We've, knock on wood, we've never gotten sued yet. Hopefully we never do. We've gotten close a couple times, but I think that's, like Ben says, that's, you're hitting the right nerve if something like that is happening. It means that they don't like the story that you're telling, which isn't necessarily that it's wrong. You know what I mean? We have had a couple factual errors through the years, but it's impossible not to at some point. Yeah, I think it's really important to feel like you have the space as a journalism organization, as an individual journalist, to actually tell the story that needs to be told. And without that space, if you're like always in fear of covering something, saying the wrong thing, making someone mad, then you don't get to tell the whole story. And that's not worth it.
Yeah. And when telling a story, Ben, like, how do you decenter yourself in that? Like, I'm sure you have opinions, right? You're at a school board meeting or you're talking to someone and they're saying something, and you're a human being. So I'm sure you've got your own like thoughts, ideas, whatever. Like, how do you kind of step back for anyone who's not super familiar with journalism or being a journalist? Like, what is your process for making sure that something is objective as opposed to more opinionated?
Yeah, I think that's a really important topic, and especially in today's climate when journalism as a whole is kind of under attack from from everywhere. It seems like even people who you wouldn't think would be skeptical, our distrust in the news is at all-time highs. So I think sticking to the facts, being objective, like you said, is kind of paramount now. And I think it's for better or worse, just part of the job. And when I'm reporting on something that I personally might feel a certain way about, I have to keep in mind, I have to remember that as a journalist, you're allowed to have opinions, but it should just never make it into the work. Because to get back to that point of credibility, if you're reading in the New York Times and you can feel someone's opinion in it, then they start to lose credibility, because then you're not fact-based, you're opinion-based. And I think, again, it's just so important, because I mean, there are really, really great opinion columnists and writers who are fact-based, but they inject their opinions, and that is really, really great. And I read a really great piece recently in the New York Times. It was in their opinion section about Israeli prison camps and their treatment of Palestinians. And that was in the opinion section because the reporter was giving his opinion, but it had really great fact-based reporting. But that still has to stay separate. I think that, like, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but as soon as you inject your own opinions, you're sort of losing your credibility, and then you're inviting all these, just for example, like a conservative or right-wing pundit to point and say, oh, like, you write for X, Y, and Z. Well, they're just basically like an opinion column. So I don't have to take your writing at truth, and then you sort of lose the value. And next time you write if I write a really important thing about like a school board decision, I don't think it would be as impactful if people think that it's just my opinion. And yeah, not to get too serious, but yeah, I do think it's an important thing, right? Especially right now, because the trust is not great.
Yeah, well, and it's an interesting point, and I'm glad that you brought it up in that way, because the minute that you started talking about sort of like the difference between opinion and sort of rigorous journalism, I started thinking about our voter guide and how, like, we've made the decision. Well, Emily really, I think, and Cyril have made the decision to put out a comprehensive voter guide that covers all of the candidates. And I think even like there's obvious opinion, right? But then there's also sort of selectively deciding what to cover, who to feature, who to highlight, that is another subtle way or not so subtle way of opinion getting into the picture. And so, Emily, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how you made the decision to do a voter guide that covers everyone and let people draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, hopefully my dog isn't too annoying in the background. Lots of action on the street today. Yeah, I think that voting is about information. So I think it's really important that voters get a full picture, and they need to know who all the people are, who are all the players. But it's actually more complicated than that, because then you have to write some kind of description about them. So through the years, I have changed formats, styles of writing the different descriptions about them to try to stay as unbiased as possible. I do think it's interesting, Ben, your whole opinion of opinion, because obviously we have a lot of opinion articles. We have an opinion section of our paper. And I think that while there should and is a separation, I think it's interesting because no matter what, there is implicit bias in the person who's writing it. You know, as much as you try to not have it, you have your own perspective, and that perspective influences how you write it, you know? So I think that's really interesting. And I've actually, because I've done the majority of the work for the voter guides, like building the voter guide, doing the research, and then, you know, actually writing a million different descriptions and standardizing them. And that's the thing that I try to do the most, is standardize them rather than have people submit, you know, answers to survey questions, although we did that this spring a little bit. I don't think it's a true measure of how you can like look at people piece by piece and say these are the distinct similarities and distinct differences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because, I mean, you talked about like implicit bias and the importance of perspective and opinion. And like, I remember I was one of the people that conducted Ben's first round interview, and like, we all have, opinions. And I remember Ben coming to the table and being like, had an opinion about the Beacon. Like, here's why I would want to work here. And so, I guess I'd love, and maybe after I share mine, like we can kind of go around and all share our perspectives, but just on a personal note, because just as local as national, personal as professional, like I came to work for the Beacon because I felt like, and I continue to feel like, the stories that the Beacon writes and the stories that the Beacon tells are important. Like, we're covering topics that actually matter for people to be able to make informed decisions as citizens. Now, hopefully we're not trying to influence those decisions, but we're giving people the information that they need. And I came from a news organization previously that was doing some of that, but was also like sharing what to do on the weekends and where to go. And, and that's great. I think that there is a need for that, but I really wanted to be at an organization that I felt like was creating the infrastructure for voters to get the information that they need to make a difference in their community and nationally. So like, that's my perspective on our org, but I'd love to hear Emily and Ben, like, you share a little bit about your perspective on the Beacon and on your job within it.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, let's do. And then, Ben, I'd love to kick it over.
I have a different perspective because I built it, right? Yeah. So my background is such that I have been involved in political campaigns for many years. That's what brought me to this, is lots of my campaign experience, mostly from the graphic design and marketing side, campaign mailers and whatnot. But I was also an elected official in my local municipality for 4 years. And civic engagement is something that has been very important to me for a long time. I actually helped to get someone elected 2 years ago, and I've regretted it every day since. And I was a mercenary. I just did his campaign mailers, but then he got elected, and I've been sad about it ever since. So that's when I was like, okay, I need to pay my penance and I need to go do the right thing, because I didn't know he seemed like a nice guy in the mailers. You know what I mean? Family man, whatever.
Yeah.
So, my perspective of the Beacon has always been that there is a value to teaching people about what's actually important, like on the local level, that actually affects their daily life. As a council member, there's a lot of people that have no idea what goes on and, how it works and how it affects your daily life. And that's actually like my goal with the Beacon, is to make that connection for people to understand, like, this action by a local government board creates this consequence in your life. Just put the lines together, connect the dots. And so that's my perspective.
I love it. And Ben, how about you?
Yeah, I think actually what jumped out to me first when I was researching the Beacon before my first interview, it's just the topics, or I guess what the Beacon covered. And I really thought that was interesting and stuff that wasn't normally being covered. And just to interject a little bit about the implicit bias we have as journalists. I don't want to say that, because obviously, like you said, Emily, that just choosing to cover something is a form of bias. Like Fox News wouldn't cover the same thing as like MS Now. But I think what I was trying to say is you just don't want to come off as like you're just saying your opinion, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I just want to just reiterate. But I really like the Beacon sort of breadth of coverage. And then I thought it was a really cool opportunity. I think I said this when I first met you, Emily and Dara, that I saw this as I could see like down the road, like years down the road, that I could see just like tremendous growth. Because I think what we cover is unique, and sort of I could imagine it turning into, it's already a cool thing, but I imagine turning into like a bigger, cooler thing. So for lack of better words, so I just thought that it was just a fantastic opportunity, and it's a really cool chance to like get in sort of at the ground level with a young news organization. And as a young journalist, a lot of times you really don't sort of have the autonomy to build your beat. Like my beat is education in Lower Bucks County, but as I've been on it for I guess two weeks and a day now, sort of looking for those overarching themes, and because those themes I think will affect your sort of everyday. And recently there's been a lot of staff cuts, there's been superintendent searches. These districts are historically lower funded because they're low in lower income areas. And sort of that inequity I'm already seeing is sort of this through line that I think, Emily, to your point, that people need to, or people to be well informed should understand that this decision will affect X, Y, and Z. It's not just they're allocating this money for this that'll take funds away from that. And I think that sort of the opportunity to build this beat into something that can be a little more than just the bread and butter education school board sort of coverage. I thought that's too good of an opportunity to pass up. And obviously everyone at the Beacon is great, so it sort of worked out to be a great thing. I was going to say perfect storm, but that's not. That's sort of
Yeah. It's a great thing and a perfect storm, depending on the day.
Things, yeah.
Yeah, but for anyone watching this or listening to this, Ben mentioned he's been with the Beacon for 2.5 weeks now at the time of this recording, and he is building his beat. And so, if you happen to be a Bucks County resident or one of our readers or viewers or whatnot, what have you, and you know of anything interesting that is happening in the community or things that are not happening in the community that ought to be happening in the community, ideally with a focus on education, but really with any news, tips, leads, thoughts, you can feel free to reach out to Ben directly at ben@buckscountybeacon.com. Again, that's ben@buckscountybeacon.com. And then I mentioned that Report for America funds 50% of Ben's first year salary. My job is finding the second half of that. So if you would like to sort of contribute on the economic side to supporting our coverage of education in Lower Bucks County, or just supporting our coverage in general, you can either contact me at Daralyse@buckscountybeacon.com, or just go to buckscountybeacon.com, click on that support the Beacon button, make a donation. We have tax deductible donations you can make. You can sign up to make a recurring $5 or $10 monthly contribution. So there's all sorts of things that we can do. But I'm so glad I could talk to both of you for hours and hours, and I will, because I'm lucky enough to work with you. But are there any last thoughts that you want to sort of offer for anyone who's been watching this or listening to this?
I just want to say, I love that both of you have come here because you love my startup vibe.
Yeah, right.
It's so fun. It's so fun to be on the ground floor. And I'm glad that everyone that's come to work for me at the Beacon has come because of the opportunity to start from the ground up and, build something cool. And yes, Ben, let's make it bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about you, Ben? Anything you want to add?
I guess just to reiterate what Dara just said, please don't hesitate to reach out, even if you literally just want to grab a coffee, just talk to me about, hey, you're a new reporter in the area, let me just tell you about X, Y, and Z. It doesn't have to be anything serious, but I think a really big part of Report for America and just great local journalism is sort of making those small connections and building that out. So I'm more than happy and would love to meet any readers interested, and yeah, just excited to get started. more, I guess.
Yeah. Love that. And we'll be sure to put contact information in the show notes as well for anyone who's listening to this while driving or whatnot. Like, don't worry about writing anything down. You can click on the show notes when you get to your destination. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Emily, for having this conversation. This has been another episode of Behind the Beacon, and we'll be back in another 2 weeks. Ben might not be joining us, but who knows? Maybe we'll have another guest or a different topic. Emily and I will certainly be back. And thank you for listening and staying tuned. It's really exciting, I think, to peer behind the curtain and figure out how the sausage is made. So thanks again.